Welcome to Anthro-Dish, the show all about food, identity, and culture. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. I wanted to start this episode off a little bit differently than I have in the past, as I have some very exciting news to share with all of you. Anthro-Dish is now officially and proudly produced in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. For those of you who aren't familiar with the AAAs, they are the oldest and largest association for professional anthropologists, with over 10,000 active members, which is absolutely gigantic for an association. They have a fabulous podcast network with shows like This Anthro Life, The Familiar Strange, Anthropologist on the Street, or the more recently launched Sapiens podcast, which are all super interesting and very fun shows. And we are absolutely honored to be included in this podcast network, and very excited about the partnership and the amazing human connections that it will bring with it. So with all that being said, let's talk about this week's guest. This week I am speaking with Sophie Reilly, who holds an MA in anthropology from McMaster University and has recently begun her PhD program in anthropology at Northwestern University. Research focuses on the archaeology of ancient foodways, and she employs a paleo-ethnobotanical analysis, which is a big giant way of saying she looks at ancient plants. And she uses these ancient plants to learn about how people prepared and consumed meals in the past. For her master's research, she studied microbotanical remains taken from ceramic vessels in the late formative and Tiwanaku phase sites in the Lake Titicaca Basin of highland Bolivia. And if all that sounds really daunting to you, I promise you, stay tuned. She does a fantastic job of breaking down what this really means in a much more informal and approachable way. She identified both the local and non-local plants in these areas and explored the ways that these different kinds of plants may have become parts of people's meals, both in everyday meals or special occasion meals. Within our interview, we talk about her master's research project in Bolivia and look at the role that food played in mobility and interregional relationships during this time frame. We also explore how archaeology can be used to look at plant residues on ceramics, and have a really fascinating discussion about how local and non-local foods can symbolize relationships and identities. We also look at what it means to be local, or what it means for foods to be local, and what sorts of cutoffs are used to describe local foods in the past. Perhaps most importantly, we talk about the most famous and fictional paleoethnobotanist, Dr. Ellie Sattler. This episode also marks the first time that a certain cheeky daughter of mine makes a special guest appearance, so stay tuned for an extra goofy moment with her. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this really fun episode of Anthro-Dish. Here is Sophie. Welcome, Sophie. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Of course. I'm excited to talk to you today.
I am also excited.
So can you, to start off, give us a little bit of background about who you are and where you're from and some of the influences that led you towards archaeology?
Sure. So, like you said, my name is Sophie. I did my master's at McMaster and my undergrad in anthropology as well at McGill. I'm originally from the Ottawa area. And how I came to archaeology is kind of a funny, weird-ish story. I, as a kid, always really liked old stuff and would often dig around for treasure, and thought that this could be something cool to do, but didn't really know how I didn't know that archaeology was a real job that people could have. And so I chose anthropology, possibly literally because it was the first one on the drop-down menu of majors I could choose.
Oh my gosh, that's the best part of being an anthro major, to be honest, though.
It is. It's so convenient. Anytime it's just right there.
Yeah.
So I chose it not really knowing that it was super connected to archaeology. And then in my first year, I took an archaeology class that I loved and was like, wow, this is a real thing that I could do with my life. And then just from there, just took all archaeology classes. And then there was a prof at McGill who I really wanted to be my undergrad advisor for my thesis. So I went to her and I was like really trying to convince her that she should take me on as a student. And originally I wanted to study Inca architecture and power and stuff like that. And then she told me, no, you should study food instead. And I just really wanted her to take me on as a student so much that I was like, yeah, sure, I'll study food. Whatever you think is best. And now here I am. Now I'm an archaeologist who studies food.
Amazing. So
yeah,
she set you on a pretty decent path there.
She did. Yeah, I recently had breakfast with her about a week ago, and she was like, I take full credit for all of your success.
Oh, I love that.
And I told her that she could. So yeah. So,
that's beautiful.
Yeah. So that's how I got here.
I feel like that's very, like with any anthropologist, when you ask them how they got into it, it's always a story about like some weird prof or like something like that just kind of like encouraged them to keep going, you know?
Yeah, well, because it's so, like, I feel like it's such a random subject that it's not one that people are typically going to choose unless if there's some weird story that brought them to it.
Always.
But
yeah,
but I guess since everybody has that weird story, then you don't seem like an outcast for having the weird story, which is good.
It's like a weird tribe.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all weird.
Yeah, exactly. We're weird together.
So you're saying in there that you initially had really wanted to study, it was Incan architecture. So what about the Incans, and particularly, I mean, you work in the Andes too, so what drew you to that region?
Yeah, so similarly, it was just that the prof that I had taught it really well. So it's just like there's really interesting stories. Like the Inca have some really cool sort of foundation myths. There's just a lot of really cool stuff in the region, and then as you delve more deeply into it, there's just so many different sort of peoples in the Andes that sort of all lead up to the Inca, and then the Inca is the one that everybody knows more because that's who was there when the Spanish colonizers arrived. There's just such a rich history before that sort of all builds up into that pinnacle of coolness.
I love that.
Yeah. So yeah, like it comes down a bit to just sort of how it was taught and the fact that those classes were really good, and so I just kind of kept with it. But there's a lot of really interesting subject matter there, and for me, who ended up accidentally studying food, there's a lot of really cool food stuff because feasting is a really important part of a lot of Andean traditions, and so you've got a lot of people who are building relationships with each other through communal food practices and communal food production and consumption and drinking and all that stuff. And so there's a lot to get into there. There's all that kind of like, for lack of a better term, there's all the like really sexy feasting stuff, and then when you sort of dig a little deeper, there's also the really interesting like everyday food practices. So just like the way that people were making food and eating food in their everyday lives. So it's like there's a lot going on.
Very cool.
There's a lot to explore there.
So we're going to dig into all of that today. That's why we're here.
That's good.
So can you provide a bit of a glimpse into the time period that you were specializing in during your master's, and some key characteristics of the people and the culture that happening during that period?
Yes, for sure. So the region, sort of the sub-region within the Andes that I was working in, was the Lake Titicaca Basin. So the Lake Titicaca is lake in the high plains of the Andes. It's about 3,800 meters above sea level, and it's right on the border between Peru and Bolivia. And I was working on the Bolivia side, so in the southern Lake Titicaca Basin. And the time periods that I was looking at was two different periods. There's the late formative period, which started in about 200 BC and went until AD 475. And this is a period that we call like a period of intensification, where people had started more permanent settlements in the area about 1,200 years previously. And now in the late formative, population density is getting higher. People are trading more, both sort of within the Lake Titicaca Basin, but also with surrounding lowland regions. And we see an increase in reliance on domesticated food like potatoes or camelids, which are like llamas.
Nice.
And a decrease in a reliance on wild food, so fish and birds and those kinds of things.
Okay.
And a really frustrating part of late formative southern Titicaca Basin is that there's really blurry lines between domestic and public or ritual spaces. So there's a project that's been in that area for almost 20 years now, and what they're looking for, it's called the Turaco Archaeological Project. What they've been looking for is trying to find these domestic spaces to really focus on everyday lives, and they just keep finding ceremonial spaces. They have not yet found definitive domestic spaces. So so it makes it kind of tough to sort of get at that every day, but we're still trying. We keep trying. The second period that I looked at was the Tiwanaku period, which came right after the late formative. So that's from about AD 475 to AD 1100. And Tiwanaku is a site in the southern Titicaca Basin that kind of rose as the center of this like ceremonial or not ceremonial, kind of depending on who you talk to, polity. So it's sort of, there's a ceremonial core with an urban sprawl around it, and then Tiwanaku sort of expanded outwards from the basin.
Okay.
And there's still a lot of debate about what that expansion kind of looked like. But there is some consensus that part of that expansion was in order to get a lot of, so that people from Tiwanaku could have access to non-local goods, including food.
Okay, so the expansion, when you're talking about that, what sort of expansion? Is it like a geographic expansion or?
Yeah, so it's sort of that the Tiwanaku influence was sort of expanding from just sort of from, so there's the site of Tiwanaku, and then its influence expanded sort of first within this southern Titicaca Basin area, but then it also expanded sort of into lowlands surrounding Lake Titicaca. And so you get, so people who work at sites in valleys surrounding the lake will find Tiwanaku style objects, but also then like objects that have these interesting like hybridized styles from Tiwanaku and from that valley, for example.
Cool.
But
okay.
There's still some debate about like whether it was like more of a like not quite militaristic, but like more of a heavy-handed expansion where Tiwanaku was going and like more taking over places, or whether it was sort of a more integrative type expansion. That's still, people are still trying to figure that one out.
Oh, neat. Okay, so they're not sure if they're having that political heavy-handed approach, or if it's just like, this is a really cool lifestyle or way of making things, and that's kind of right.
Yeah, exactly.
Neat.
So,
okay, makes sense. So listeners might be a little bit more familiar, as we were talking about, with the Incan culture. So can you kind of situate the late formative and the Tiwanaku periods relative to the Incan periods?
For sure. So the Incas were around, sort of grew to prominence in about the 1400s. And something that I think is always interesting, but that I don't think people think about a whole lot, is that the Inca were only around for 150 years before the Spanish arrived and the Inca kind of fell.
Wow,
so they weren't, so it's like you kind of think of them as this really long lasting empire, and that's why people know about them, but people only really know about them, they're only the famous one because that's when the colonists arrived, so we have like more written things about them because of that. So they sort of started in the 1400s in Peru, so further north than Tiwanaku, which is where I was. And so Tiwanaku ended about 400 years before the Inca rose to power.
Okay.
And Tiwanaku was around for about, Tiwanaku was at its height for about 500 years. So just to put it in perspective, the Inca were at their height for about 100 years. Tiwanaku was 500 years.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But interestingly, the Inca also were pretty interested in Tiwanaku. So some of the, and in Lake Titicaca. So some of the Inca founding myths, or like the Inca myths about the origin of the world, draw back to Tiwanaku and Lake Titicaca.
Oh,
so,
very cool.
Yeah.
Neat. So were there, are there kind of signs pointing towards not just influence, but like people coming from that Tiwanaku ancestral region to the Incans, or not so much?
So definitely, like architecturally, some of the Inca stuff is, I think, like I think that there were claims, I can't remember if it's Inca claims or archaeological claims, that the Inca architecture was imitating Tiwanaku stonework. But the Inca people were not the Tiwanaku people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the way that we know this, or like the most recent way that we've known this, is that the Inca were Quechua speaking people, and Quechua is one of the Andean indigenous languages, whereas in Tiwanaku they were most likely Aymara speaking, which is the more common language in Bolivia. Okay. There's a third relatively prominent indigenous language that I can't remember the name of right now, which is not very good of me, but it's possible that people from Tiwanaku spoke that language or Aymara, but cool. It just like was not Quechua.
That's cool though. Like I never knew
Yeah.
that there was like the Tiwanaku language kind of was passed down towards contemporary Bolivia.
Yeah, so I think that it's like I don't know as much about this as I should, but there is sort of debate about what the Tiwanaku language was, and that is being politicized in a certain way, sort of around who in current times gets to claim to be a potential descendant of the Tiwanaku people.
Cool.
So it's kind of a politicized topic in recent years.
Like, do you find with skeletal remains and stuff, that's kind of arising?
Yeah, well, it's also just that in Bolivia, the president Evo Morales is the first ever indigenous president.
Oh wow!
And so indigeneity is becoming more politicized in an interesting way. And his inauguration was at Tiwanaku.
Oh,
so Tiwanaku itself as a site is becoming this kind of really like polarizing space in a way,
and then kind of resurging as a political place for people.
Yeah. And so that's where sort of the language of the original Tiwanaku people comes into play, is sort of who gets to politicize and claim Tiwanaku as an ancestral place.
Wow, that's really interesting. I love the connections between the past and the present too. That's always really cool.
Yeah, it's definitely definitely an ongoing issue. And the connections just sort of like it makes doing archaeology in Bolivia lately can be very complicated, because sort of like getting permits and being allowed to do archaeology there as like a white North American person, it makes it challenging for some white North American archaeologists.
Fair. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And depending on like who you're partnering with and how they relate to the government.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Fair. So let's jump into your thesis work. So your thesis title is Meals in Motion, Ceramic and Botanical Investigations of Foodways in the Late Informative Tiwanaku. So I love that title. I always love like when you can put some clever stuff in there. So when you're talking about meals in motion, what do you mean by that? Was there like a form of Uber Eats for these people?
There was not, sadly for them. I do have to add a caveat though that I think that my MA supervisor, Andy Roddick, would be mad at me if I didn't, is that I was a little bit riffing off of some titles of previous articles that he had written that were other things in motion.
Fair.
But I was like, Meals in Motion at least is alliterative, whereas his others weren't. So
you upped them there, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but yeah, so they didn't have Uber Eats, unfortunately, unfortunately for them. But yeah, so what I was interested in my thesis was looking at the circulation of foods. So like I was saying, when contextualizing the sites I was looking at, is that the Titicaca Basin.
I'm really sorry. I have to pause you because someone just snuck out of bed right now.
Mommy. All right, go for it.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Mommy. Yes, Bob. It's time for bed. Ray. All right. So, so what do you mean by meals in motion?
So like I was saying at the start when I was sort of contextualizing the sites that I was looking at. So the Lake Titicaca Basin is located at really high elevations, which means that only certain crops can grow at those elevations.
Okay.
So things like potatoes, quinoa, things like that, which means that what I was kind of really interested in looking at was whether or not non-local plants were coming into play, or sort of being consumed or prepared, or I guess both.
Yeah.
At these sites. And originally the project as it was conceived was I was going to be looking at just one site that was sort of on the eastern shores of the lake, which is at the nexus between the highlands and the lowlands. And so in theory, a lot of sort of lowland crops would be potentially coming in to the Lake Titicaca Basin through that site.
Right.
So yeah, so basically that's what I was interested in looking at, was sort of whether or not crops were in motion, what like the circulation of goods through this area,
Cool.
and then how local and non-local goods were potentially used together or not used together um, in the context of meals. So like how people were sort of taking these non-local foods and integrating them into their everyday practices.
That's so cool because that's something, you think about in terms of globalization a lot in current populations, but when you think of people in the past, you don't necessarily think about like how they were trading or interacting with other regions. So.
Yeah. So I was able to get at some of those questions, which was really exciting. It was one of those things where for a really long time I was not finding those non-local crops, and then sort of in the last like 3 weeks of my lab work,
nice.
I found a lot of them and I was like, they're all here.
Success.
Yeah. So nice. But yeah, like you were saying, it's not always something that that you think about, or that then also it sort of becomes this question of like non-local foods then kind of take center stage over the local foods in some discussions. If you're sort of like, there's something cool and new here, like let's just talk about that.
Yeah.
But I was finding sort of both local and non-local, which gave me the opportunity to sort of explore a little bit the potential interplay between those.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And like the normalization between it too. I like that you're kind of, because like sometimes you tend to get more excited about what's, non-local and what's new and exciting and not what you're used to. So
exactly. Cool. Yeah. So for example, like one of the foods that I found and that is pretty like commonly the most exciting or the most well-researched, I guess, non-local food is maize or corn.
Oh, okay.
So in lots of like sort of across Andean research pretty broadly, like maize is seen as like this really ritually important crop that was used to make chicha, which is a maize beer, a corn beer.
Yes.
That was used in ceremonies, and like people drank it a lot at parties, basically. And so I did, and it is sort of a accepted notion that this was an important part of Tiwanaku ceremonial practices and or statecraft, depending on where you're coming from. And so I was able to, like, I found maize, I found it in context that suggested that maybe it was consumed as chicha. But then one of my committee members at my defense was like, don't forget that by this point, maize will have been present in this region, if not grown locally, but exchanged in for at least 500 years.
Oh, wow.
So even if it's non-local still at this point, it may not be something that's new.
Yeah.
Which is like an interesting thing to think about, of sort of at what point does something become, like, even though it's not grown locally, at what point does does it still have that novelty? Like you were saying in modern context, like we eat a lot of food that we can't grow in this region, like bananas.
True.
But
or even
they're not
like quinoa.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's like it's not special anymore. It's just like it's from far away, but it's still.
But it's normal. It's expected.
Exactly. Yeah. So sort of trying to figure out that. It's like I guess like trying to not like over extrapolate meaning into a food while still sort of keeping your eyes open to the idea that it could be either normalized or used in special contexts or both.
Or like have that sort of a different sort of status than a local food.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. I like that. Good balance.
Yeah, trying to.
So your work takes interest in broad regional changes. So as an archaeologist, what are some of the ways that you can explore these changes or shifts? And can you kind of link these up to how people might have felt those shifts in day-to-day life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is maybe going to sound weird, but I'm more interested in coming into like projects where we already kind of know that a broad regional shift is happening.
Fair, rather than speculate.
Yeah, and then
I don't blame you.
Sort of trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the daily lives through food practices.
Cool.
So like potential shifts that are interesting to look at is like environmental shifts, political changes to like periods of like mass displacement of peoples or colonization. So either when people have to like move out of where they were from, or when new people arrive, or both at the same time. And then like looking at how these affected everyday life through food for me is about looking at sort of both continuity and change in people's everyday lives, but also framing both of those kinds of things as deliberate, right?
Right.
So I feel like for me anyway, like before I started actually seriously thinking through these kinds of questions a couple of years ago, it was always about like, how do people's food practices change over time, and what does that tell us?
Yeah.
But it's also about, do their food related practices stay the same over time, and what does that tell us, right? Because it can also be a deliberate choice
to
keep this. Exactly. Yeah. So things also like looking at how certain things, how what's conceived of as edible might shift or stay the same.
Cool.
So like in like modern North American contexts, a lot of things that are in theory edible, like bugs, are not socially edible.
Oh, socially edible. Sense. I love that term. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. So it's sort of like looking at what people choose to like choose or have to continue to eat or start eating.
Okay.
And so you can look at like, so for example, if you look at periods of environmental shift, and so like, for example, in Africa, the person who's actually going to be my PhD advisor, so hopefully I describe her research well here.
No pressure.
So her name is Amanda Logan, and she works in Ghana, and she looks at sort of food security in Ghana through from like the 1500s or earlier, sort of through modern day times.
Oh,
and
wow.
One of the things that she found is that in the past, in pre-colonial times, there were instances of drought, but that people continued to eat their preferred foods in that time. And so that is an indication that despite the environmental shift, despite the drought, food, like people did not have food insecurity because they continued to eat the foods that they preferred. They didn't have to sort of like shift to things that had previously been socially inedible in order to survive. So sort of that kind of continuity can be an indication of how people's lives were changing or were not changing in these kind of broader contexts that we might think would have a really big impact or not a big impact.
I like that. And especially having, putting the context of what sorts of surrounding stressors could have influenced that, and thinking about how diet didn't change, which is a question that a lot of people don't really look at.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's because it can seem kind of like, it can seem boring, right?
Yeah, it's not the exciting, sexy research that.
Exactly. But if you're contextualizing it within this sort of, if you're contextualizing it within the context of like these other massive changes happening, then it can like show a certain amount of resilience, or like on the part of the people who are actually living these phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So
I like that. Yeah. Very nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Foodways.
Sure.
So I find Foodways, like how people use that word, tends to vary depending on like what discipline they're in, or even within anthropology, like depending on what you're looking at, it differs. Mm-hmm. So when you use the term, or do you use the term Foodways, I guess?
I do use it.
Okay, yes. Sweet. So how do you use it as an archaeologist?
Okay, so when I saw that you had this question for me, I went and dug up the person who originally coined the term Foodways. His name was Jay Anderson, and he used it in his 1971 dissertation, which was in folklore and folklife studies. And his definition is that foodways are, quote, the whole interrelated system of food conceptualization, procurement, distribution, preservation, and consumption. So for me, what that means is that if you're saying I'm studying food, then that could be as simple as like making a list of the things that people were eating. And that's kind of boring. Like, it's like kind of it leaves you with a so what question, right? Is if all that you're looking at is just what people were eating, then
Yeah, like what does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. So to me, it's more about sort of taking into account like the practices surrounding this. So it's like people had to either cultivate or go out and gather their food, be it like plants or like animals. Then they had to like bring it back, store it, prepare it, serve it, eat it, discard whatever extras there was, or store the extras. So it's just a way to sort of keep us on our toes as to like keeping in mind everything that goes into preparing and consuming food, is that it's not just a list of ingredients. It's like people's lives could like probably revolved around a lot of these practices. And so it's about sort of like re-peopling and re-practicing the past for me, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really handy way of looking at it. And I think like for me, I always think about it kind of like the way that you think about like the water cycle in terms of like rain, and then the rain goes into the ground or whatever, and you kind of like think about that cyclical thing. So it's interesting to see how it's the same in archaeology, but it's also kind of differing based on how you're looking at people, because you're looking at remains, like artifacts, and not necessarily looking at the people living, right?
Yeah, I really like that, the water cycle analogy. That's good. Yeah, but it can be tough, like like you were saying, like it can be tough sort of when you just have artifacts to try to figure out what was going on around them. And then sort of in that vein, like it's finding the balance, right? I think I was saying earlier, like not wanting to pull more information out of it than is actually there.
Yeah.
But also not wanting to just sort of leave it at the list of plants that I found, right? It's like you want to be able to speak to how people were living, but also don't want to sort of put actions on them that weren't actually happening.
Yes, which I find that's one thing with archaeology that it's so interesting to see how people handle that, because they can either create like an over narrative or an under narrative, and it's really hard.
And it's tough, and it's sometimes I'm like, oh, I should just go to like a period when there's also texts.
Yeah. Right.
It's something that I found like pretty frustrating at times when working on my thesis, because it's like you want to sort of create this interesting story, but you also don't want your story to be complete fiction.
Yeah, and you feel like you're writing fiction sometimes. Like I found I did bioarc, but towards when I was writing my thesis, I was like, this is a story. This is story time with Sarah. This isn't facts.
Yeah, and that's like where it becomes important to then like show your work to someone else. It's like sometimes when I would go to my committee meetings and I'd be like, oh, this is a really good point. I was like, oh, I'm really glad you thought so.
Yeah, because I was going to toss that.
Yeah, I was not sure. And then sometimes I would have to be reined in, and they're like, I think you're overdoing it a little bit. Like, all right, good to know.
So true.
Yeah, so that's why we have adult supervision.
Oh yeah, right. Oh gosh. Okay, so let's dig a little bit into because you obviously study plants and botanical remains. So the term paleoethnobotany, can you explain what that means?
Yes. So I can break it down into the paleo is old, ethno is people, and botany is plants. So it's like old plants that people did stuff with.
I like that. That's the best. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So basically it's like the study of ancient plants. I, as is probably evident by now, use that to look at ancient foodways. But some people also use it for like to look at environmental shifts, because if you have different plants in particular spaces, that can tell you people stuff about climate in an area. So it sort of has multiple applications.
Okay.
But I specifically am interested in food.
Cool. And so the term is kind of like inherently relating how people use plants. It's never just looking at old plants and like what was there, right?
Yeah. So that's paleobotany is its own separate discipline,
right?
Where people look at plants. So an example of a paleobotanist who I admire a lot is Dr. Ellie Sattler from Jurassic Park.
Yes. Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I thought you were going to say a real person. I was like, how do you know this?
No, I don't know any real paleobotanists as far as I know.
But Ellie Sattler's.
Ellie Sattler is enough for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, so she was looking more at like plants that dinosaurs interacted with. But if you throw the ethno in there, then you're looking at plants that humans interacted with.
Cool. I love that there's a dress. I was waiting for Jurassic Park reference on this podcast, and you're the first one to make it. So
yes,
very happy.
You're welcome. When I first started, when I first learned that that paleoethnobotany was gonna be my methodology of choice, that Halloween I went as Ellie Sattler.
Amazing.
So I was like, I'm just gonna lean into this.
Yeah, you got it. Just embrace it.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
That's awesome.
So
cool. And I'm sure like you didn't have to look for a Halloween costume because it's just what we wear. So, yeah.
I definitely the pink salmony that I definitely wear all the time now. I'm like, yeah, this is my Ellie Sattler look.
I love it. Okay, so within paleoethnobotany, you are looking at microbotanical remains, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So can you describe what those are and how they might be different from macrobotanical, and what sorts of information you can pull from looking at microbotanical remains?
For sure. So macrobotanical, which is the one that I don't do yet, but hopefully we'll learn soon.
Cool.
Is plant remains that you can see with the naked eye. So things like seeds, tissue, wood, charcoal, things like that. But you can see it with the naked eye, but you still study it under a microscope. It's just a lower powered microscope. And then microbotanical remains is things that you can't see with the naked eye. So what I look at specifically are called phytoliths and starch grains. And the way that I usually like to describe these is they are microscopic plant fossils.
Okay.
And they can be diagnostic to species, family, or genera of plants.
Cool.
Some people also study pollen, but I do not. And macrobotanical and microbotanical are pretty complementary to one another. So some people study just one, some people study both. But it can be really good to use them together because some plants can be identified through both methods, but some plants can only be identified through one or the other, which means that if you're only looking at one, you're going to be missing, you might be missing some plants that were actually present.
Okay.
So I was lucky in my MA research. I was working in an area where a lot of macrobotanical studies had been done before I got there. Nice. So I was able to sort of use those to complement my microbotanical findings.
That's awesome. So then you got that whole, or like a bigger sense of the picture.
Exactly. Yeah. Nice. And then what's neat too is, so for example, with maize or corn, which as I said is like a pretty important plant in the region, different plant remains can identify different parts of the plants. So microbotanically, there are two types of diagnostic phytoliths, and one is diagnostic specifically to the leaves, and the other is diagnostic specifically to the cob. And then maize also produces a diagnostic starch grain, which is from the kernels. And then there's also, you can find sort of macro remains of cobs as well. And so in an ideal situation, you can not only learn what plant was being used, but also what part of the plant, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Especially with something like corn, because you just assume like, well, they're just eating the cobs, but if they're using parts of it.
Yeah. So there's like, we had been doing an experimental archaeology project at McMaster, which sort of a little bit fell through due to time constraints.
Fair.
But I had been working with Shanti Morel-Hart, who's a professor at Mac, and Éloi Bérubé, who was another MA student in another cohort mate of ours. And we'd been sort of using obsidian blades to cut various fruits and vegetables that are found in Mesoamerica, which is where Shanti and Éloi both work.
Okay.
And like one of the things that we were doing, I think also, was then using corn cobs to sort of scrub the obsidian blades afterwards to sort of see whether that was something that would leave phytoliths or starch grains, because then it can sort of help you get at different types of uses of a plant, not just food related uses.
Neat.
But like if people were using sort of naked corn cobs to clean off like their blades or their pots or things like that, then sort of how would that show up in the archaeological record?
That's so cool.
Yeah, and since we never finished the study, I don't know. I don't have an answer.
That's fair. That's fair.
But yeah.
So what was the importance of obsidian within that? Was that like a specific choice or just kind of whatever you had?
It was a specific choice. That was there was a site in Mesoamerica that Shanti was working on or was interested in, that they had been using obsidian blades. And so what we were trying to do is sort of try to figure out what different types of uses for the blades could lead to different types of like deposition of of like plant stuffs on them. So we would have some where we just used one blade for one particular type of fruit or vegetable, and then we had some where we used it for like 3 different ones, and then it was about like trying to figure out and then it was about like extracting the samples from the blades and then putting them under the microscope and trying to see sort of what plants turned up on it. And we did sort of the first step of it. We did the cutting up part, and ended up with some cuts on our fingers because obsidian is really
it's so sharp. Yeah.
It's really sharp. And then we never got to the step of extracting and putting under the microscope. I think that they will get to it eventually because LWA is going back to McMaster next year. So
cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So possibly the study will carry on without me.
Cool. So I'll press him for that next year.
Yes, you should.
Okay.
Yeah, you should do like a live episode as they're discovering things.
Oh my gosh, that'd be so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, but the advantage though is that the longer we wait, the more artifact like these obsidian blades become.
True. Yeah. Modern artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Exactly. I do think that like experimental, like I definitely if it's possible within my own dissertation work to do experimental stuff, I think that it has a lot of potential in terms of figuring out like sort of how plants deposit into artifacts could be really cool, because one of the things that I'm interested in is recipes and sort of how like what types of recipes people were making. But then it's really tough if in some of the artifacts in my MA work I found different plant remains on the same artifact. I think there was one where I found like arrowroot and maize. And then it's like maybe they were used together, but maybe also this pot was just used for multiple meals throughout its lifetime and wasn't scrubbed perfectly clean. So I think that experimental stuff within paleoethnobotany has a lot of potential to teach us sort of to help us understand what we're finding. So hopefully that's something that will continue to grow.
Yeah, that's really, and I think it's neat, particularly with foods, because even if you think of like a cast iron pan today, right? You know, you're kind of told not to scrub it with dish soap and to like soak up the flavors of the meals that came before it. So you get all these, I'm sure if you were to do an analysis, you get all these like really gnarly remains all kind of in there in the same thing. So
and exactly. And it comes back to the whole like how much can you extrapolate from the fact that like multiple things are in the same pot.
Cool.
So
I love it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. You mentioned artifacts, and you were looking at ceramics in particular. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Sweet. So what sorts of vessels or artifacts were you looking at, and how do you use them to find out? I mean, we kind of touched on this, but how would you use them to find out about foodways?
Yeah, sure. So in paleoethnobotany, you can there are multiple ways that you can get at your samples. You can either use soil samples directly from the dirt and process them in a ton of ways, or you can extract samples directly from artifacts. which is what I did for my MA research. So I extracted samples directly from ceramic artifacts, which is accomplished by washing them in 3 particular ways. And so most of the artifacts that I was looking at were ceramic sherds, so like small broken ceramics. I was really lucky in that when I was in the field, we happened to find some full vessels that had been burial goods that were unwashed before I scientifically washed them. So all of the dirt, which is what contains for me like the really valuable,
the good stuff,
was still there. So I was able to extract that dirt, which was really exciting. Yeah, so I was looking mostly at just sherds, so pieces of broken ceramics.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. And so with those broken pieces, did you have a sense of, could you kind of look at, a rim of a ceramic sherd and just be like, oh, this is from like this type of plate or this type of bowl, or not so much?
So sort of, and slowly, because like not as well as somebody whose main focus is ceramics, fair. I would say. But yeah, so basically, especially on one of the I guess in the whole area that I was working, like a lot of previous research has done ceramic analysis. And for one of the projects that I was working on, the Taraco archaeological project, a lot of work that had come before, including Andy's, my supervisors, was sort of figuring out like these like typologies, I guess, for forms and pastes, which is like the recipe for the clay, basically. So basically there was like this guide that you kind of use to figure that stuff out.
That's handy.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's handy to have like one of the people who worked on developing that like 2 tables over, so you can like wander over and be like, is this what I think it is?
Oh my gosh.
And then either get told, no, what are you what are you thinking? Or yes, that is in fact what you think it is.
That reminds me of like early excavations as a student, and you pick up a rock and you're like, what is this? And they're like, it's literally just a pebble. Sarah, like, put it down.
I definitely still have a pebble that I found on my field school that I was like, this pebble is really smooth, it must be an artifact. And they were like, no, it's from a river, it's a river pebble.
It's just a pretty
and I was like,
pebble.
well, it's really pretty and I'm keeping it in case it turns out to be an artifact. So
it is now.
Not that people should keep artifacts.
No, never. No.
Only rocks.
Yeah. River pebbles. That's it.
Yeah, keep your river pebbles, but not artifacts. Turn those into the scientists.
Yes.
Who can tell them apart from rocks.
Yes. Sometimes.
Yeah. I just don't turn them into me, because like I can't. I won't know, unless if it's dirt that contains plant remains, then I'm then I'm your person. Yeah.
So you're gonna get bags of dirt sent to you now.
I probably walked right into that.
Yeah.
So it's my own fault.
Okay, so we kind of talked about this earlier when you were kind of giving the context of who you're studying, but what were seen as like staple foods for consumption or preparation during the time periods that you were looking at, and did that line up with what you found in your own research, or was yours like totally separate and different from what you're expecting?
So the staples were mostly like plant-wise, it was a lot of tubers. So potatoes, which are a pretty well-known one, and then a few which are less well-known in this part of the world, called uyuku, oka, and isanyu. And they are just highland tubers that grow at those high elevations. And those are all identifiable with microbotanicals, but trickier to identify with macrobotanicals because they don't produce seeds, and the soft tissue of tubers is really degradable. So that was exciting because I had the potential of being able to identify those.
That's cool. Yeah. I would have thought the total opposite, that generally macrobotanicals would be easier, but yeah, I never thought about that.
Yeah, it's because of the degradation. So in areas like the coast, like the coast of Peru is really dry as an area, and so things like softer tissues like potatoes preserve more.
Okay.
Which is also why like I think like mummy bundles are more common in those areas, because like the soft tissues of plants and humans preserve in that environment. But in the highlands, despite the fact that I remember it being pretty dry, I guess it was not dry enough to preserve tubers. Quinoa is another big one in that area. And Maria Bruno, who's an archaeologist in the Titicaca Basin, has done a lot of research on quinoa if people are interested in learning more about quinoa. But unfortunately, quinoa starch grains are too small to be diagnostic through microbotanical analysis. So that's one where macro is the way to go.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Less common plants that have been found in that area are amaranth and then various species of beans, like the common bean and the lupine bean. And beans are something that we can identify microbotanically. And then meats were like camelids, so like llamas or llamas, depending on who you're talking to.
Asking.
Yeah. And then fish from Lake Titicaca itself, and birds. And then, like I said earlier, even though it's not a local one, maize is a pretty commonly found one.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Oh, and also sort of ceramic evidence from previous ceramic analysis, sort of based on forms of cooking pots and the type of clays or pastes that people were using to make their cooking pots, and then also carbonization patterns inside or outside the cooking pots suggest that people were probably like slow cooking their foods in sort of like soups and stews and porridges.
Okay. Mm-hmm. A classic easy staple food for any household.
Exactly. I think there's I think it's in this dissertation from the 90s. The person who wrote it, his name is Lee Stedman, and like I think that she talks about the potential, like how you can just sort of visualize people with these big cooking pots and sort of leaving their food in the cooking pots over the coals so that it's like slow cooking while they like go take care of their kids or whatever. And it's just like this really kind of cool visualization of, wow, you got all that from just like a potsherd.
True. That is really cool.
So, like that one I totally buy. Like I'm like, that makes sense.
That makes all the sense. I mean, we still do that. You put your rice or your beans in to soak all day, and then you come home and you make them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I like that. Good visual.
Yeah.
Okay. So when it comes to what you were finding in your results, did you find any foods that came from, well, you talked about maize, but were there any other foods that came outside of the local region in your analysis? And can you speak to what this means in terms of political or environmental relationships that people had?
Yes. Yeah. So despite what one might think from the entire interview up to this point, maize was not actually the only non-local food that I found. I also found manioc or yucca or cassava. Those are all the same, three names for the same plant. Arrowroot and sweet potato. So those are all lowland plants that I found. The local foods that I found, just to sort of contextualize, were potato, uyuko, which is one of those tubers, and then some potential beans. And so the maize, like I said earlier, is like the most commonly studied one. People used it in chicha and feasts. It's been found in grave contexts. And so there's a lot of interesting theories about how it might have been one of the foods that was used to sort of serve the dead, which I will get into a little bit more in a little second.
Yes, please.
But that what I think is kind of possibly the more interesting, because it's not one of the ones that's sort of been done to death, for no pun intended, was that the manioc, the arrowroot, and the sweet potato are all lowland tubers. And like I said earlier, like this local staples were highland tubers, like potatoes, right?
Right.
And so what I think could be happening here is something to do with like familiarity. So like what we were talking about even earlier, this notion of like what's socially edible foods, is that if people are confronted with like foods that are not from where they're from, what are they going to be more inclined to take? The one that's more familiar because it's similar to what they're used to eating and what they grow themselves, or something that's completely foreign to them and doesn't seem necessarily edible?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really good even if you think about traveling today, like I find a lot of people are more likely to go for a bread or a starch or something that's, how your stomach's going to handle it versus going into that like weird gooey food that you see, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
And so like there's a lot of sort of other instances of this in like other archaeological research of just sort of when new items are introduced, sort of like the context of local practices will like shape how people receive new things. And so so I think that this could be what's coming into play there.
That's a cool find.
Yeah. And so sort of the last place, I guess, where sort of the local and the non-local, I think, had an interesting interplay was in this burial that I mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah.
So this burial was a Tiwanaku phase. So if you remember, that's sort of the later phase from about 475 to 1000 AD. And this burial was not at Tiwanaku proper. It's at another site called Chiripa, which is sort of still in the southern Titicaca Basin. And it was, we don't have a whole lot of context from the burial itself because it was excavated by the local Chiripa community while they were building an addition to their school.
Okay.
So they excavated it, but I was able to sort of take the dirt from those pots and analyze it, which was really, really great.
Yeah.
Because all of the other ceramics sort of from that site had been washed when they got excavated, which meant that sort of all the data that I could use from it was washed off of them. So these ones were not. And in this burial, there was, I thought, like a really interesting interplay of local and non-local that I'm honestly still trying to think through. And so like I said earlier, there was this notion in the Andes that's like pretty common, I guess, this idea of people feeding the dead, like offerings to the dead would include not only objects but also potentially food. So there was these 5 vessels, 3 of which I analyzed the dirt from, and I think all of them, all 3 that I analyzed, I found food remains in. So there was one that was a llama-shaped vasija, which is a jar, so a llama effigy jar.
Wow.
And in that I found maize remains. Okay. And this is a type of vessel that's like the tail itself is a spout. So the tail is a spout. It's a form that's like pretty commonly understood from other Tiwanaku ceramic analysis to have been for liquids. So I think probably that there was chicha in that llama vessel. But what's really cool here is that there's like llamas are a highland, like a local altiplano Titicaca Basin animal, and maize is a non-local, right? So it's like you're putting this like this thing that was like that a lot of people think was like the symbol of the non-local in this vessel that is the symbol of the local.
Oh, interesting.
Another thing that I found was potato starch grains in one of the vessels. So it's sort of comes back to this idea of just because you had non-local stuff doesn't make the local crops any less important. So you still find potato in these potentially like special occasion contexts. At Tiwanaku proper, the highest sort of one of the highest densities of potato remains is from a ceremonial context. So potatoes were still clearly being used in these like special occasions. And then I found in a bowl some manioc or cassava or yuca starch grains, which could have been there because it was like eaten as stew, sort of like tubers, like potatoes were.
Right.
Or there's also some accounts of in Amazonian contexts, manioc being consumed in a chicha-like drink, which is chicha is that maize drink that I mentioned earlier. So it's like, was just manioc coming to this area, or was also the practice of consuming it as chicha sort of traveling with the plant itself? I don't think that like manioc in one bowl is enough to sort of make an argument about it either way.
Fair, but
it's still kind of this interesting, like either it was consumed as like stew, sort of like how potatoes were, or it might have been consumed as chicha, like how maize was. So like either it's becoming kind of like potentially like fully assimilated into local practices of how you usually eat tubers, or it's still associated with this like non-local chicha practice, or it's something completely different that I haven't thought of yet.
But it's cool that like you have that ability to look at the different ways in which one finding could mean multiple things.
Yeah, and that's like the advantage of also being able to take into account the ceramics that I found them in. Like the form can hint at potentially how it was cooked or consumed or those kinds of things.
Right. So, cool. Yeah. So having that context too. And I think it's cool too, just like when you're talking about the llama effigy vessel, I guess, is that what you would call it?
Yeah, yeah.
How you're talking about like the symbolism behind it and getting into that, like what those two things kind of intertwined could mean in terms of like the person's identity or ancestry or whatever.
Yeah, so I think that idea originally, sort of the idea of the llama as the symbol for the altiplano, and then the maize as the symbol for the non-local. I'm sure that it's been used a lot of times, but the place that I first remember reading it was in a dissertation by a student whose PhD advisor was my undergrad advisor.
Oh, okay.
And so I was like, oh, this is really cool. This person makes so much sense. And then I was like, oh, because we were trained by the same person.
Our brains are the same.
Probably why we think the same.
That's
possibly
fair. Cool.
But yeah, so it's like, I think it's like this really interesting potentially interplay between the local and the non-local. Or it could also be, like I was saying earlier, how maize, even though it was non-local, it had been around for probably about 500 years at this point. It could also be that maize sort of had like wasn't necessarily still thought of as non-local in the same way that we sort of assume that it was.
Right. The same way we assume bananas are.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like it was definitely still special, but sort of how it was assimilated or how it was thought of is, I think there's still like potentially a lot of interesting questions there that I don't 100% know how we would be able to answer them just based on archaeological evidence, but like I think it's definitely important to keep thinking through so that we don't sort of end up making assumptions about what things mean. Basically, the moral is that with archaeology, it's like it could be this, it could be not this, who knows?
That's one thing I love though about archaeology is like it's one of few disciplines where the answer I don't know can technically be the best answer.
It's true. Yeah, it's definitely a discipline where you have to come to terms with the limits of your own knowledge.
Yeah, but it's humbling, and I think a lot of disciplines, don't necessarily have that. So I don't know.
And it's too because it's like it is like it can be sometimes I think easy to forget that like it's still you're talking about people, and so it's like I feel like when you get those reminders that it's like these were people's lives, then it becomes like it holds you accountable in a way that it's like, you can't just like completely make stuff up, because then you could be misrepresenting like how people lived and like they were
and like their legacy.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's very thoughtful.
Keeps us on our toes.
Okay, so just to wind things down here, can you or do you have any resources or upcoming projects or anything like that you would like to share with the audience?
I don't have any upcoming projects because I'm currently not in academia right now for the next 2 months, and then I'm starting a PhD. So who knows who knows what that will, where that will lead me.
We'll have you back and you can share your new finds.
Yeah, for sure. If you'll have me.
Oh, absolutely.
And then resources, as I was, I don't know if this is like counts as a resource, but as I was prepping for this today, I was finding some of my undergrad readings that were the Inca like Inca myths, and they're not actually food related, but they're really neat. they're these really cool myths, just sort of about like Inca foundation and like the things that happened during Inca time, and they're written in the colonial period. The two that I have on file were written by one of them is by Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, and the other is, I think, Juan de Betanzos. And they're just like really cool if people are interested in learning more about Andean stuff or Inca stuff.
Sweet.
They're like these really cool myths that you can read.
That sounds good.
For some light bedtime reading if you're a nerd like me.
Yeah, light bedtime nerd reading.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. I will put those in the show notes for anyone that wants to check those out. Perfect. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sophie. It was so fun talking to you about your research. That was Sophie Reilly speaking about her archaeological research in the Lake Titicaca Basin in Bolivia. If you're like me and super fascinated with Sophie's work, you can find her on Twitter and Instagram at RileyDigs to learn more. Sophie has kindly provided some interesting research and resources about the Incan myths and just some more background on the Incas. So I've attached those in the show notes below for you. And one of them is a free article if you'd like to check that out. I've also put them on my website. It'll be at anthrodish.com under episodes, and it'll be on Sophie's post. And if you'd like more Anthrodish, please find us on social media at Anthrodish for Twitter and Facebook, or Anthrodish Podcast on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, as always, and I would love to hear some feedback about what you're loving, what you would like to see in the future, and anything else that you'd like to share with us. So please feel free to contact us on any social media outlet or through our website. Thanks so much again, and we will see you next week.